Welcome to today's webinar presented by Supercoder.com. Supercoder.com is an online coding solution offering Part A and B coding reference tools, resources, and not more than 30 specialty coding and compliance newsletters from the Coding Institute in one site. I hope you enjoy this short session.
You've just always done it that way, and you didn't know any better. So let's get started as we look at the second slide. This is a disclaimer slide, but it's also my reminder to say to the participants, if you hear something on the audio conference today that gives you pause, that makes you think that maybe you should change the way you're doing something, do not change the way you're doing anything because Jill said so. It should be changed because you looked at the rules that I talked about and you saw that the rules were the thing that was dictating the change and not something a speaker says, because sometimes I can misspeak or you might mishear, and I would hate to have you change the way you do something without looking into the fact that maybe that rule is still in effect, because we know in medicine things change ever so quickly. And so, again, if you hear something, do some research, make sure it's current, make sure it's correct what you heard, and that you're doing it from a rules perspective, because I am all about the rules. As we go through, I'll try to note what slides we're on. If you have questions, we're going to leave time at the end. And if you make note of a slide number, that'll help us all to flip back to that slide if your question pertains to a particular slide. All right, so documentation. Boy, it is the key to all problems, but it's also the solution to our problems. We have problems in our procedures code selection if the documentation isn't good, or we have justification for our code selection, our use of modifiers, our diagnostic codes, the medical necessity that we see, because we have cert errors that tell us that if we don't have an indication for a procedure, then there is no medical necessity. Remembering that in our documentation, each code that we put on a claim form is potentially part of a standalone piece of documentation. And of late, I've had a lot of providers saying, well, if you just looked in the chart, and I'll go, no, this procedure or this test is what they're asking about, this singular date of service with a singular code on it. And when I pull that piece of paper out of the chart and look for the pieces of information that the code requires, I'm not finding it, and therefore this service is under-documented, inadequately documented, or fails completely. So we want to be sure that we remind our providers of that, especially as we look at our electronic health record, where there's things all over the place in the electronic file. But again, each document that we're looking at needs to have enough standalone information on it to meet the necessity or the requirements of the code. We want to make sure that we also have something that's frequently forgotten in our documentation, the condition of the patient, pre- and post-operatively or post-procedurally. The documentation should paint a picture, and therefore the coding should paint a picture of that patient's encounter, whether it's for a pulmonary function test or it's for a bronchoscopy. On slide number 4, I have information from the 1995 ENM Guidelines, and I know you're thinking we're not supposed to talk about ENMs, we're supposed to be talking about procedures, but I thought this is a good place to start, because as you look at the very first sentence, it says the principles of documentation listed below are applicable to all types of services in all settings. So it's a good place to start to think of what kinds of things do we need to have documented. We know if we go searching for sometimes specifics on what do they want in the documentation of a given procedure, that we can find specifics to the code, but what about the other stuff, the stuff I was just talking about, the patient's condition, stuff like that? That's a part of it too. This is a reference here that tells us the record should be complete and legible. And remember, legibility is to the auditor. If the auditor cannot read what is written down, then that record fails. And yes, you can appeal, and you can potentially win.
Supercoder is the fastest growing online reference tool with more than 25,000 subscribers. Call 866-228-9252 to get a free product demo, or sign up at supercoder.com for a 7-day free trial.